Welcome everybody to the November Foundry Series program, and we're really excited to see you all tonight. Before we introduce our speakers and get going, I just wanted to make a couple of announcements. First off, I want to thank our sponsors, Hunt & Williams, for continuing to make this program possible. I'll thank them again later, because I can't thank them enough. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker tonight, Ari Kelman. So Ari Kelman is the Chancellor's Leadership Professor of History at the University of California, Davis, where he teaches a wide range of courses, including Civil War, Reconstruction, the politics of memory, environmental history, Native American history, and America in the 1960s. He has written many books, but most recently you probably saw his Downstairs on the Counter, Battle Lines, A Graphic History of the Civil War, as well as A Misplaced Massacre, Struggling Over the Memory of Sand Creek. And he's working on a book currently, tentatively titled, For Liberty and Empire, How the Civil War Bled into the Indian Wars. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Ari Kelman.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure. There's two ways we could do this. I can either be very self-conscious about the microphone, or I can also try and do this. I'm used to lecturing in front of very large, okay. If you're good with that, it works much better for me because then I don't have to try and position myself. But can everyone hear? Oh, you want me to? Okay. We're going to do both. Well, but if I shout, then he's going to end up, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to go with very self-conscious. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate the introduction. Thank all of you very, very much for coming out this evening, for sharing your evening with me. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here for a variety of different reasons, but I'm going to focus on just one. This is a museum that, for its own set of reasons, some of which I know a bit about, but I'd like to actually learn more about at some point, it has a very expansive understanding of how to interpret the history of the Civil War. That's been an intellectual project that I've been engaged with for a very long time, and so I'm very, very grateful to be in this kind of a space where that kind of work is being supported in this way. And so with all of that said, I'm going to try and do this relatively informally, but I have a bit of a problem. When I'm informal, I tend to be glib. I make a lot of inappropriate jokes, and the material tonight's not funny. And so I actually made a last-minute decision to write out a text just to remind myself to take this very, very seriously, particularly for Dakota people. This is a kind of living history. This is history that they struggle with on an ongoing basis. And so I want to honor the way in which that history functions in their lives. In late December of 1862, along the main street of Mankato, Minnesota, workers who were on the federal payroll constructed a makeshift stage that was designed explicitly to host a kind of a morality play, a play about the sanctity of white civilization and the resilience of the besieged Union. Early the morning after Christmas, again Christmas 1862, throngs of people, thousands ultimately, close to 10,000, began pouring into Mankato. At precisely 10 a.m., a company of uniformed soldiers escorted 38 Dakota people up a short flight of steps to a raised platform that you see here. Hangmen then hooded the condemned men before slipping nooses around their necks. A drum beat, a single beat of a drum, announced the beginning of a countdown to the fall of the platform that you can see here. The Dakotas grasped one another's hands. At a second report from that drum, they all shouted their names out loud. When the drum banged a third time, an axe fell, the rope that suspended the platform splintered, and that platform fell. Thousands of observers, reportedly led by a small boy who shouted out, "Hurrah, hurrah," started cheering. 38 Dakota people dangled by their necks in what was an unseasonably warm December day, and so ended the largest public execution in the nation's history. A day before that, coincidentally, Abraham Lincoln met in Washington, D.C. with Senator Charles Sumner, whom most of you probably all know as a martyr on the road to the Civil War. In 1856, years before that meeting with Lincoln, Sumner's speech, The Crime Against Kansas, suggested that freedom would flourish in the United States so long as white men had easy access to free land in the West. Land that Sumner was quite clear would be taken from Native American people who he described as, quote, savages, end quote. Sumner also warned in The Crime Against Kansas that admitting new slave states to the Union would tip the balance of power in the United States Congress to the American South. The nation, he prophesied, in that event very well might fracture because of, he suggested, competing conceptions of what we would today describe as imperialism. 2 days after Sumner gave that speech, of course, Congressman Preston Brooks caned him in the chambers of the United States Senate, one of the episode's most notorious episodes of political violence. But let's go back to Christmas 1862, when Lincoln and Sumner gathered in Washington, D.C. The two men reportedly talked about the Emancipation Proclamation, which a week later would open a new chapter in the nation's history. On New Year's Day, 1863, a civil war that had started as a fight to control the nature of expansion into the American West, in other words, a war that began as a war of empire, would become a war of liberation as well. So in the coming weeks, Northerners and Southerners alike would focus their attention, for the most part, on the meanings and repercussions of emancipation. They would, as a result of that, ignore the execution of those 38 Native people in Minnesota. But what I'm going to try and suggest, just for about 15 or so minutes tonight, a very brief set of remarks, what I want to suggest is that the fate of the Dakotas and the fate of the United States remained inextricably intertwined, that threads of liberty and empire couldn't easily be disentangled during the era of the Civil War and the so-called Indian Wars. Now, flashing back a little bit, what became known as the Dakota War started in the summer of 1862. August 17th, 1862, a group of Native American hunters killed 5 settlers near the town of Acton, Minnesota. This is a very rough sketch of that event. The Dakotas then fled to their reservation, where they announced, quote, "There is a war with the whites and we have begun it." Their village chief knew that the United States had been split by the Confederate Rebellion, and that as a result of that rebellion, the federal government had withdrawn most of its soldiers from the region, not only from Minnesota, but from throughout most of the American West. Perhaps the time had come then to drive white settlers out of Minnesota, this chief mused, but before making that decision on his own, he wanted to confer with other tribal leaders, including a powerful chief, a man named Little Crow, who you're seeing here. Very early the next morning, as Little Crow listened to this village chief and to the hunters recount their story, he pondered what had brought all of them together in such a fraught moment for his people and for the United States. A decade earlier, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had empowered local officials in Minnesota to begin purchasing tribal property. Treaty commissioners had, as was common at the time, employed divide and conquer tactics. They'd forged a compact with one small group of Dakotas and then used that agreement against the larger body of the tribe. On August 5th, 1851, federal officials agreed to pay roughly $2 million in cash, but mostly in annuities, for 24 million acres of Dakota land, and then to create a reservation sited on both sides of the Minnesota River for the dispossessed tribal bands. So you can see that reservation right there. The Dakotas struggled over the next few years with the transition to reservation life. Farming proved very difficult for them. The government was a fickle patron. Annuities arrived late. Sometimes they didn't arrive at all. The tribe's agent in 1854 concluded that, quote, "The advance of the whites over the frontiers has been so rapid in Minnesota that the hunting grounds of the Indians have been taken from them before they've had a chance to become fully domesticated," end quote. In March 1857, a frustrated targeted group of Dakotas killed more than 40 white settlers living in Spirit Lake near the Minnesota-Iowa border. There's a famous woodcut. The next year after Minnesota became a state, so we're talking about 1858 now, federal negotiators insisted that the Dakotas needed to cede half of their land or forfeit their entire reservation. The Dakotas reluctantly agreed to what they understood to be a bad deal, but better than the alternative. The election of 1860 then further exacerbated tensions for the Dakotas. Abraham Lincoln's victory triggered not only secession conventions, but also, because of the transition from Democratic to Republican administrations, housekeeping on the federal payroll. A new Dakota agent decided in Minnesota that he was going to pay out annuities only to those Native people who agreed either to work for wages or to farm. Things became even more dire in the winter of 1861 and 1862. First crop failures and then bitter cold caused widespread famine among the Dakotas. Rumors circulated that white authorities in Washington and in Minnesota were diverting treaty annuities, payments to the Dakotas, to finance the Civil War. Then, in the summer of 1862, traders and merchants decided that they were going to deny the Dakotas credit. They weren't sure that the Dakotas could make good on their debts. So on August 4th, a group of Dakotas responded to this by breaking into a food warehouse on their reservation. The next day, Little Crow observed, quote, "When men are hungry, they help themselves," end quote. Andrew Myrick, a storekeeper who was at a meeting where Little Crow said this, replied, quote, "So far as I'm concerned, if your people are hungry, let them eat grass," end quote. The commander of federal troops who were stationed nearby restored order by promising to distribute food throughout the reservation, all of which leads us back to Little Crow's house on August 17th and 18th, 1862. After he listened to these hunters describe what had happened, he acknowledged that the Civil War occupied the federal government's attention. Still, he reminded the people who were gathered with him about the unbridled power of the United States. He asked them, quote, "Do you hear the thunder of their big guns?" end quote. Nevertheless, he agreed to lead the Dakotas into war. Now, what I would suggest is that many of the factors that pushed the Dakotas toward clashes with settlers leading to 1862 also shaped the road to the United States Civil War, especially the fight to consolidate an emerging American empire in the trans-Mississippi West. For example, the 1860 election, which we often recall as having pivoted exclusively on the issue of slavery, was also a referendum on continental expansion. The Republicans' Free Soil platform was an updated version of Thomas Jefferson's Empire for Liberty. Freedom in this view hinged on the transfer of property from indigenous peoples to white settlers. Yeoman farmers would work Western land without slave labor, the Republican Party suggested, in the process becoming more virtuous citizens and also civilizing the frontier. The Democrats, by contrast, insisted that slavery, unfettered by federal regulations, should be allowed to sink roots into Western soil. Voters elected Abraham Lincoln, of course. Southern states seceded, taking their congressional delegations with them. The Republican Party then repurposed this constitutional crisis into a kind of an opportunity to overhaul the nation's political economy and geography. Republican lawmakers implemented their party's vision for an American empire in the West. They passed landmark legislation in the spring and into the summer of 1862. The Homestead Act, the Pacific Railroad Act, and the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act. Along with the newly created Department of Agriculture, these programs provided land and learning to settlers, underwrote transportation networks so that Westerners could relatively reliably bring goods to market, and gave farmers access to technical expertise. The conquest and colonization of the American West was supposed to accelerate at a breakneck pace in the aftermath of all of this legislation having been passed. But then violence in Minnesota threatened the Republican Party's grand plans for the region. On August 18th, 1862, the Dakotas' annuity payment, which had been delayed by the Civil War, finally arrived in Lower Agency, Minnesota. But before traders could open their shops, Dakotas, led by Little Crow, circled the settlement. A warrior entered the store of Andrew Myrick, the man who weeks earlier, you might recall, had suggested that if Indians were hungry, they should eat grass. Myrick leapt out of a second-story window and sprinted for cover in the nearby woods. Soldiers later found his body slashed with a scythe and riddled with bullets and arrows. His mouth, unsurprisingly, was stuffed full of dried grass. After the Dakotas burned Lower Agency, they launched an offensive on Fort Ridgely, an emblem of federal power in the region. Little Crow wanted to push U.S. troops out of the area entirely, but the garrison leaned on its superior firepower to thwart this onslaught. The Dakotas withdrew and burned the town of New Ulm and other nearby towns, killing hundreds, perhaps thousands of settlers on that first day of this war. The logic of American imperialism, including the Republican Party's plans for the West, hinged on two things: an abiding faith in white supremacy and also geographic determinism. Native peoples would, the argument went, inevitably vanish, that was the language that people used, inevitably vanish when faced with the overwhelming power of white civilization. But now the Dakotas and Minnesota were launching a territorial and cultural counter-revolution. They wanted freedom of their own definition. They wanted the freedom to live as they chose, to hunt rather than to farm, to maintain their political sovereignty. Little Crow's people were inverting the expected outcomes. They were sweeping back east rather than retreating or vanishing into the west. Minnesota's Governor Alexander Ramsey telegrammed the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. The Dakotas, Ramsey said, were an existential threat to the United States and to the Republican Party. He begged for help from the federal government. He also organized local militia. On September 1st, Dakotas killed more than 60 people at what became known as the Battle of Birch Coulee. The next day, the Dakotas thrashed troops near Forest City and then burned that town as well. Little Crow's followers had emptied yet another swath of Minnesota, creating what became a huge column of refugees. This is just a picture of some of them. News of what was happening in Minnesota, of this Dakota War, reached Washington, D.C. in August of 1862. On August 25th, Horace Greeley, writing in the New York Tribune, claimed that the Dakota War had its roots among Confederate agents. The Sioux, Greeley insisted, quote, have doubtless been stimulated, if not bribed, to plunder and slaughter their white neighbors by white and red villains sent among them for this purpose by the secessionists, end quote. Editors of Scientific American agreed, writing, quote, this rising of the Indians is the result of rebel machinations, the Indian War being designed to keep at home a considerable portion of the military force of the frontier states. And so in this way, two distinct but interrelated conflicts became, for many onlookers, a single fight to preserve the imperiled Union. Abraham Lincoln made that connection inextricable when, after General John Pope lost badly at the Second Battle of Bull Run, the president reassigned him to try and impose quiet on Minnesota. Pope arrived in St. Paul, saying that he would hang any Indian found guilty by a military commission that he was convening. The adjudication of the Dakotas' cases was brutally streamlined. Defendants were not allowed to enter pleas. Trials typically took less than 10 minutes. In early November, the military commissioners handed down the last of their sentences. They had heard 392 cases in 6 weeks. 303 warriors would go to the gallows in Mankato. President Lincoln, though, worried that rough justice was running amok on the frontier. He noted that he was, quote, anxious not to act with so much clemency as to encourage another outbreak, nor with so much severity as to be real cruelty, end quote. He eventually winnowed the list of condemned men down to 38 nicknames. Little Crow, meanwhile, ventured further north with his followers. After failing to persuade other tribes to join him in his war, he turned to British troops in Canada. He wanted to open another front for the Union to defend during the Civil War. Little Crow's grandfather had fought against the United States, again against the United States, with Britain in the War of 1812. And so Great Britain owed his family a debt, Little Crow reasoned. He arrived at Fort Garry in Manitoba a day after the execution of the Dakota 38 in Mankato. His men carried the Union Jack and medals bearing the likeness of George III that their kinfolk had received from English troops about 50 years earlier. British officials were totally unmoved by this kind of pageantry and by Little Crow's pleas. Little Crow then realized that he was out of options. The following spring, he and his son, Wawanape, began heading back to Minnesota. In late June, they arrived at the Sioux Reservation. On July 3rd, Little Crow and his son were picking berries near Hutchinson. A shot rang out. Little Crow returned fire from his rifle. He wounded one of his assailants. Then a rifle ball caught him squarely in the chest, killing him. This is the site where he was killed. On the same day that Little Crow died, July 3rd, 1863, Union and Confederate soldiers were locked in combat at Gettysburg. Violence in Minnesota and in the Civil War dragged on. Governor Ramsey chose, after Little Crow's death, to make an example of Minnesota's Sioux peoples, signaling that even if the Union appeared in that moment fragile, the project of empire building in the American West would not be derailed by Native Americans. Ramsey suggested that, quote, the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated wholesale, or at least driven forever beyond the borders of the state, end quote. The ensuing fighting did just that, pushing many, really most of the state's indigenous peoples into the Dakota Territory, where they kept fighting as part of a pan-tribal alliance to hold back the flood tide of American imperialism. Those struggles, including what became known as Red Cloud's War, resulted in the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which the United States would violate repeatedly, including during the Great Sioux War, which included the Little Bighorn. That treaty remains at issue in Indian Territory, remained at issue during the protests at Standing Rock, and is, in my view at least, one more legacy of a civil war that is in some respects unfinished. Thank you very much.
So we're going to ask you to hold your questions until after our break. We're going to have our next speaker speak. We'll take a quick, maybe 5-10 minute break, and then we'll reconvene to introduce our community partners and take questions from there. So our next speaker is Keith Richotte. Keith Richotte is a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians and an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and is the author of Claiming Turtle Mountain's Constitution, the History, Legacy, and Future of a Tribal Nation's Founding Documents. Keith also serves as an associate justice on the Turtle Mountain Tribal Court of Appeals. So please help me welcome Keith Richotte.
Well, hello. Let me begin by confessing that it is entirely possible that I know less about the Civil War than anybody in this room. Okay. I am here to talk about Indian law and policy. Now, I know that people get real excited when they have the opportunity to hear a lawyer talk about the law. But I want you to please contain your excitement, right? Just keep in your seats and we'll all get through this together. Okay. So what I want to do today is give you two really big ideas to help contextualize Indian law and where Indian law and policy was in the 19th century, before, during, and after the Civil War, right? But we have to start with two big ideas to really help us understand how we need to think about these things. And these are a couple of thought experiments that I initiate with my classes at UNC. I won't make you go through the entire project. I won't ask you to actually volunteer, but I want you to at least think through them with me as we describe them so that you have a sense of what it means to engage with Indian law, okay? So the first question that I want to ask you, right, is I want to ask you, who is the most famous African-American entertainer in the world today? Oh, Oprah. Okay. All right. Well, all right. So, no. Look, no, it's just a reminder of the demographics that I normally work with, right? That Oprah doesn't come up so much. It's that's okay. But that's a good answer. That's a good answer, right? So, who is the most famous, excuse me, Latinx, Latina entertainer in the world today? J-Lo's still the queen, right? She always comes up in these conversations, right? So let me ask you this. Who is the most famous Native American entertainer in the world today? This is always my favorite part. The quiet that settles over the room, right?
The guy that stars on Long.
The guy that stars on Longmire. Okay, all right.
Not the one that stars.
Oh, not the one who stars. Okay, all right. So he doesn't even get to star. Okay. Okay. So we can maybe come up with a name or two, but we realize that there's a bit of a struggle here, right? That we realize that those names don't come nearly as easily as they do with other groups of peoples, right? So when we start thinking about that, we begin to recognize, oh, wait a minute, maybe we don't get to see Native peoples in an everyday context, right? That maybe we don't get to see Native peoples in the same way that we get to see other groups of peoples. That they're not as present in our everyday lives and conversations and media that we consume in the way that we see other groups of Americans. Okay. And that should make us think then, okay, if we don't get to see Native peoples in this context, right, if we don't get to see them every day sort of out and about, what do we know about them? Where do we get our ideas about them? Right? Where does our understanding of Native America come from? What sort of symbols do we see? What sort of representations of Native peoples do we see? And since you're so amenable, I will ask the question, where do we see representations of Native peoples? Okay, powwows for those of us who go. A little louder, please.
Virginia Museum of Fine Arts.
Oh, okay, all right. That's not normally an answer I get. Yes?
If you're in the military, and we participated every year, they invite groups in and they recognize Native peoples, all different Native tribes from across the United States. I was at one in Sumner at the Fort Greeley facility that's got a name long and I can't remember all of it. But they did a great job because they covered a lot of history.
Okay. So occasionally we see some programs, perhaps kind of like this one, right? In different sorts of places. But I'm thinking more specifically about popular culture, right? Where do we see Native representations in popular culture?
They're depicted in various television programs. For instance, the one that she mentioned, Longmire, there's a reservation that is portrayed as part of this program.
Okay, all right, so occasionally on TV. Where else?
Old Western movies.
Old Western movies, that's a big one. Good, what else? Yes?
Or in symbols, images that maybe people don't recognize as indigenous because of cultural appropriation.
Okay, certainly issues of cultural appropriation pop up a lot, right? Where else?
The film The Wind Talkers.
Okay. All right. So sometimes we see films like that, the Wind Talkers, about the Code Talkers in World War II. Sports teams. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that my Vikings happened to whoop up on a certain football team not too far from here. Okay? But we see that imagery, right? Anybody buy a box of butter lately? Okay. All right. So then we start saying, okay, there's some commonalities in these images that we see, right? That there's certain understandings about these images that we see that are present to us in ways that real, actual Native peoples maybe aren't, right? So what are the commonalities that we see in these images, right? Well, very dark skin. Right? If it's a male, then we're looking at a warrior. If it's a female, we're looking at a maiden. Right? Perhaps most importantly, always stuck in the past. Right? Always someone who's situated in the past, never in the present. Right? That's always somebody from a different time. Right? Let me ask you a question. You ever seen an Indian wear a suit and tie? Let me ask you another question. Do you realize that's a trick question? Okay. So when we begin to examine where we see Native peoples, right, and what it might tell us, right, we begin to recognize that all of our imagery, all of our understanding, at least in pop culture, tends to stick Native peoples in the past. And that maybe, just maybe, if that's our only information about Native America, perhaps maybe we don't actually know a lot about Native America. So, let me give you a few things that, a few key things that I think that you ought to know about Native America. That there's a lot of them, right? That I can only give a brief conversation in my talk here today. But three big things that I think anybody ought to know if they're going to extend their thinking beyond just tonight's conversation. Okay. The first thing to know is that to say Indian or Native American or whatever term we're going to use is much like saying European. Okay? In that what you're doing is you're describing a large group of people with a tremendous amount of diversity within that group of people, right? That have some sort of common bond, right? But that don't necessarily always see themselves in conjunction with one another, and that there's a tremendous amount of difference and variety amongst the different peoples within Native America. So it's a lot like saying European. Okay. The second thing that I think you ought to know if you're thinking about Native America is that Native peoples are different than other minority groups in the United States. And I will explain why that is in a minute. But before I go any further, I want to make sure that I am clear that that is not a value judgment. That doesn't mean that things are better or worse for Native peoples than other minority peoples. It just means that there's a different context, okay? So that when I give talks like this, sometimes I will get the question at the end of the question and answer period, well, who had it worse, blacks or Indians? Okay? Do you want to know the answer? Would you like to know the answer? Okay. The answer is yes. Okay? The real question is, why are you asking? What is it that you would want to know? What do you think you can do with that piece of information? Right? There was enough suffering for everybody to go around. Okay? Why is there a sense or a need to quantify that? Okay. And then the third thing that I want to mention about that is that what makes Native people different is that there is a political relationship with the federal government and often state governments that doesn't exist in the context of other minority peoples. Now again, this is not a value judgment, this is just stating what is. Right? A lot of it comes from the treaty history, but there is a political relationship so that Native tribes will often talk about the nation-to-nation relationship that they have with the federal government. Right? So that political relationship really changes the dynamic in multiple ways and gives you a whole new perspective on how to understand these things, right? Okay, so that's the first big idea, that maybe we don't know what we think we know about Indians. Okay, now here's the second one. Okay, the second big idea involves the law more broadly. So a couple of years ago, I took my wife to London over the holidays for a holiday trip, okay? Yes, I know. I am a terrific husband. It's true. It's true. All right. We went to London, and then of course we had to take a cab to the airport when we were leaving. Has anybody here been to London? Okay. Anybody driven in a vehicle in London? Okay. Tell me what that experience is like. It's terrifying. It's terrifying, right? Why is it terrifying? Because those idiots drive on the wrong side of the road. Right? They drive on the wrong side of the road, and it feels weird. It feels weird to be on that side of the road. Right? It just feels so strange. And at this point, I won't make you do this, but at this point when I'm talking to students, I ask them, let's take the next 10 seconds, close your eyes, and just imagine driving on the left side of the road. Okay? And I love doing this example because every now and then, some student will literally jump. It's like, it's that frightening, right? But then we have to ask ourselves the question, well, why do they drive on the left side of the road and we drive on the right side of the road? Is our choice better? Okay? Can we think of one logical or moral reason why driving on the right side of the road is better than driving on the left side of the road? Right? And I love asking this question too because someone will inevitably say, well, we're right-handed, they're more right-handers, right? So maybe driving on the right side of the road is the way it ought to be. Which then forces me to ask, well, aren't there more right-handers in England? Right? Because if it's a left-handed country, as a left-hander, I'm going. Right? I'm going to go hang out there. Like, see how the other half lives, right? And I get a number of different possible justifications. God bless my students, they try. They really try their best, right? But we eventually whittle it down to getting to realize that there doesn't seem to be any intrinsic value in the choice of right over left, right? That either one will do, okay? Either one is fine. We know why we have to choose a side of the road, right? We know why that choice needs to happen, okay? But there doesn't seem to be any real reason why the right is better than the left. Okay. But then still, right? We think back to our example, or for those of us who have been over to London. It feels weird. It feels weird to even imagine driving on the left side of the road. Okay? Feels just strange. Well, why does it feel so strange? Right? Why is it that we do this, and why does it feel so strange to even imagine an alternative? Right? What would happen to you if you had driven on the left side of the road to get to tonight's event? Right? What's the best thing that could have happened to you? The best thing would have gotten arrested, right? Right? Best thing would have been to get stopped. Right? So why do we drive on the right side of the road? The law tells us to. Right? The law tells us to. And this is just a very small example of just what a gigantic, powerful social force the law is. Right? That the law tells us to drive on the right side of the road, and it takes a choice that is otherwise without value, right over left, and gives it meaning, gives it value, to the point that we cannot even imagine driving on the left side of the road without feeling weird about it. Right? That the law can make us act and think and feel in ways that are not necessarily even obvious to us. But it's that big of a social force, right, that it makes us react in ways that are even invisible to us. So that's the second big idea, right? That the law is this gigantic, powerful social force that can make us think and act and feel in ways without us even really knowing it. Okay? So now here's a question. Here's the fun one. What happens when you smash these two ideas together? Okay? What happens when you take the notion or idea that we don't necessarily know a lot about Indians, and the law is this gigantic, powerful social force? Right? What happens when those two interact? What does the law tell us about Indians? Okay? And how does that make us react to tribal peoples? Back then and in the here and now. As you got to hear about earlier, it wasn't like the federal government was real cognizant of what was happening with Native peoples or was real interested in Native America beforehand, right? So what is happening legally at this time that gives us some context for how to understand how the law was thinking about Native peoples? And I don't have a lot of time left, so I'll do this just very briefly, right? The federal government has gone through different periods of policy as it concerns Native peoples in order to answer the so-called Indian question, right? Now, this Indian question is much like the so-called Negro question of generations before, right? That there's this idea that we have a problem with this minority community and we got to figure out what to do with it. Now, of course, many within that minority community say, it's not our problem, it's somebody else's problem. Right? And we'll leave that to the side for right now, other than to say that the federal government at different times has tried to figure out what it's going to do with these Indians. What kind of law is it going to initiate to try to handle the fact that we have Native peoples that we need to engage with? So prior to the Civil War, we were in a period of policy called removal, where the idea was we, the federal government, will help take Indians here in the East, bring them out to the West where there's plenty of land. Since we can't get along with them and interact with them, it'll be better for everybody if we just separate ourselves from them and they can settle out there and do their Indian thing out West. Okay? Now, this program, or this policy was supposed to be voluntary, right? Well, you can imagine how voluntary it really was. All right, there was a lot of coercion to push peoples further out west. Right? But the idea is we're going to separate ourselves from Native peoples, and they'll be happier, we'll be happier, everything will be great. And in fact, removal led to two very famous court cases in the 1830s that I won't bore you too much with, other than to say that many scholars regard it as the biggest constitutional crisis prior to the Civil War. Okay. So then we get the Civil War, where Native America, in many respects, gets forgotten, right? And that the people who are engaging with Native America can do whatever they want, right? Because the folks in Washington thinking to themselves, well, we got other problems that we need to deal with here, okay? But after the Civil War, the federal government turned its attention back to Native America. Right? And it once again re-engaged with this so-called Indian question and said, well, you know, the way we're going to solve this Indian problem is we are going to destroy Indianness. And we are going to turn all of these people into individual farmers. The most famous quote from this period of time, which we call the allotment era of federal policy. The most famous quote from this period of time was a man by the name of Richard Henry Pratt, who was really engaged with the boarding schools, if you know anything about that history. And he said something to the effect that his purpose was to kill the Indian and save the man. So it was a true attack on Native America, an attempt to destroy Native peoples. Right? So we can begin to see, right, just in these very brief examples, that the federal government had this Indian problem that it was trying to deal with, right? And that the law operates on Native peoples in many different ways. But we don't necessarily know a lot about Native peoples. And the law forces us to think different ways about Native peoples. And the way that that law has developed continues to inform how America thinks about Native peoples here and now today. And I think I'm out of time, so we'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Keith. So what we'd like to do now is take just a quick 5 minutes. If you need to jump up, use the restroom, stretch your legs, grab a drink of water, and then we'll reconvene here in 5 minutes where we'll introduce our wonderful community partners for the program tonight and open it up to you all for some questions with our speakers and partners. See you in 5. And I'm going to call up a couple of our community partners tonight, and I'll just introduce them briefly, and they'll be able to tell you all of the wonderful work that they've been doing and tell you a little bit more about the organizations that they represent. So first, I'll call up Ashley Spivey, who's the director of the Pamunkey Indian Museum and Cultural Center, and is representing the Pocahontas Reframed Native American Storytellers Film Festival. Thanks, Ashley.
Good evening. Hello, everybody. I just wanted to first thank the American Civil War Museum for inviting us to be community partners. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I usually have a naturally loud voice, so I have no problem. I just want to thank you guys for inviting us back here again to partner in your Foundry series, which I think is a wonderful way to bring history to the present and make it relevant for the present, because we're still dealing, with the consequences of our past. And I think our speakers obviously, touched on that very much today, that the past is not in the past. It's a very much a part of our present and how we think about ourselves as a nation and how we think about other peoples within our nation. So thank you to you both as well for your talk, for your presentations. So just a little bit about who I'm representing today. I am a member of the Pamunkey Indian Nation, which is a community here in Virginia. Our reservation is located in King William County, Virginia. It is one of the oldest continually occupied reservations in the United States, established in 1646 through treaty negotiations with England. So well before the United States was ever created, which ironically led to the main reason why you do not have federally recognized tribes in Virginia until recently. My community was federally recognized officially in 2016. So we are the 567th federally recognized tribe here in the United States. Thank you. Yes, it's a long journey, a journey that I think began before I was born or when I was a toddler. So it's been a long time coming. I'm in my 30s, by the way, just to give you an idea of how long that's taken. So I'm here representing the Pamunkey Indian Museum and Cultural Center, which is again located on our reservation. That institution opened to our community and to the public in 1980. It's a place where we tell our own story from our perspective, and that is really special because unfortunately it's if not one of the few, if the only places in the state of Virginia where you can get a Native-centered perspective on Native-centered history in the state. So please come visit us. We are closed down for the winter coming up soon, but we are open by special appointment, and you can find our number online on our website. So please just give us a call, and we'd be happy to accommodate anybody who wants to come and visit and learn a little bit more about our community, over the thousands of years of occupation in Virginia and on our reservation lands. So just a blurb about that. I could talk all night as well, but I won't do that. The film festival. So it's called the Pocahontas Reframed Native American Storytellers. It's the first annual Native Film Festival here in Virginia, and I think on the East Coast. It is happening this weekend, November 17th through the 19th. I welcome all of you guys to come. It's going to be taking place at the Byrd Theater here in Richmond, Carytown. Yes, new seats, which is a big deal because they are so uncomfortable. And if you're planning to be there, it's literally film after film after film with the directors, with actors from these Native-based films that are going to be there telling their stories from the perspective and artwork of film. So I recommend you guys come out for that. You do have to register for tickets. They are free. All you have to do is go to the Facebook page or to the website and get those tickets so that you can get entry into the theater. So please, definitely come out for that. I'm proud to say that our Assistant Chief, Brad Brown, was one of the key movers behind getting this film festival established. It involves all Native communities here in Virginia as partners, as well as several other partners. The Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, I think, is one. The Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. I know I'm forgetting folks. Forgive me if I am. 2019 Commission for the Commonwealth. So please come out and visit. And I think it's really special, especially the title Pocahontas Reframed. The reason why they chose Pocahontas Reframed, obviously, everybody knows who Pocahontas is. So she is, a attention grabber. But the way that the native partners in building this film festival thought about Pocahontas is that her story was one of the first Native stories to be told not from the truth, not from a Native perspective. So this is helping to kind of right that wrong from the film perspective. So please come out. Again, thank you for having me here tonight, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. And I'm next going to call up Theresa Preston, who's a board member of the Cherokee Nottoway Indian Tribal Heritage Foundation and the curator of the Tribal Foundation's Mobile Museum. Theresa?
Osio. Wakwasati time, except it's night. That's hello and good morning. I'm an honorary member of the tribe. I do have some native, not well documented, Siouan, we think, or suspect, through a grandfather's grandmother who magically appeared with no father or mother on a marriage certificate. We've been tracking her down, though. The tribe that I represent, the Cherokee, Nottoway is in parenthesis in the name. We honor both. But Cherokee means people at the fork of the stream. And they speak the Iroquois dialect or language, similar to the Six Nations up in the northern states of our United States and Canada. And they have their language documented through several people who took the time just 200 years later after colonial contact. And my question to most people is, how much of your language would you remember after 10 generations of speaking another language? So what we have is more of a vocabulary than an actual language. It's on our website at Cherokee-Nottoway.org. But I invite you all to come. We hold 2 powwows a year, one in July, one in November. We just finished up the one in November, which was November 3rd, 4th, and 5th. On the 3rd, we hold a school day, educational programs for schools that are SOL-oriented, and they get an immersion into being on a reservation, walking around, or on tribal land, I should say. It's not a reservation. We do all this through our foundation, which is the Cherokee-Nottoway Indian Tribal Heritage Foundation, Incorporated. The tribe itself is not incorporated with the state. We wanted to remain a separate entity. So we have a foundation that handles the fundraising and nonprofit part of our tribal business. I invite all of you to go to our website and look up the language, look up our schedule for our upcoming programs. We also have what we call Primitive Skills Day, where people come out and do stuff the old way, the making of bows and arrows, flint knapping, Lord, I don't know what all you'll see, cooking over fire, leather tanning and stretching, and anything, all the old crafts. It's a come and sit down stuff. It's not, you got to be patient with this stuff. It's not Disneyland, if you know what I mean. But come down and see us. We're in Cortland, right off of 58. Easy to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Theresa. And with that, I want to call up Keith and Ari, and we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. Anybody have any questions for Keith or Ari? Yes, sir.
I just read one of the Wolfen Dog. I think what comes out of that is just this inevitability about this print book. What you had was large immigration of folks who weren't going to assimilate, which is called an invasion. So, you have a comment about how this is going to go on different?
Yeah, the older, wiser professor passed the microphone. That's to the lawyer. Yeah, that's quite a trick. I like that one. What I will say about that is I don't believe in inevitability. Right, I believe that choices were made based on a number of different factors, and I believe that there was enough sense of entitlement to the land by enough people who could convince themselves that Native peoples weren't doing it right and weren't using it right, and thus created justifications for the actions that they've taken. That's happened throughout history, right? That's the way these things. Well, let's take a step back. That we can see examples of this happening in many different contexts, not just Native America. But I think that it involved choice, and when you look at the historical record, you will realize that there are there are examples, lots of examples of people who are making arguments, and not just Native peoples, who are saying, this isn't right, this isn't the way that it should be. And so I think one of the things that's interesting, the further you get into the history, is that you realize that there was the what we like to call the counter-narrative as academics, right? That there was the other story coming not just from Native peoples, but from non-Native peoples as well, too. So I think essentially enough people felt justified enough in trying to acquire enough land for themselves, and there was enough self-interest that allowed this to happen. It didn't have to be this way. Treaties were negotiated, and if they had been honored, then perhaps we would have a different history. But I think that we end up being told this narrative that it was sort of inevitable, manifest his destiny, so on and so forth, right? But I'm not so sure that I personally buy that, right? I think that, again, it's a matter of choices that were made by people who had certain ends in mind. I hope that answers or speaks to your point.
Question, front and back, Mike?
I had a question for Ari.
Oh, you get this back now. All right.
There's a pretty decent argument to be made, or there's a pretty decent book to be written in which you would you could periodize U.S. history from, let's say, 1848 through 1890, from the U.S.-Mexican War through Wounded Knee, and see that period as one long moment of uninterrupted conflict, and all part of one semi-continuous or at least interrelated series of wars of empire. And I actually think that Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee frames that period of U.S. history in somewhat that way, though it sees it as an echo of earlier periods in the nation's history. Another person who to some extent looks at U.S. history in that way is Helen Hunt Jackson in Century of Dishonor, which gets published prior to Wounded Knee, but Jackson again sees United States history as a history between. She would go a bit earlier. She would actually go to the removal period that Keith was talking about earlier, as a history of empire. From my perspective, I think that that's a perfectly reasonable way to frame things, but I think it's incomplete because it ignores the way in which different nations have their own internal and external diplomacy. So Plains tribes, and again, I'm building on something that Keith said earlier, each of these nations is in fact a nation, right? You when you're talking, and actually, one of the great errors in the talk that I gave earlier this evening, one of the ways in which it does violence to the past is that I talk about the Dakotas as a single entity, but actually there are 4 or more bands of Dakota peoples within that polity And so when we're looking at the Civil War, sorry, this is I am actually orbiting a point, and will eventually land on it, I promise. When we're looking at the period of the Civil War, what the lens of the Civil War allows us to do is to think about the precarity of national status. The way in which the United States and Native nations all are in a constant process of invention and reinvention, and the United States' reinvention of itself hinges on the struggle over slavery, but also on the question of what to do with the West. But then, looking at these nations themselves, the native nations themselves, they're undergoing similar processes around similar questions. Some of them are grappling with the question of whether or not they should hold slaves. Some of them are dealing with questions of whether or not they should migrate to new areas. Some of them who they have very, very fraught relationships with. And so again, it's my sense that by using the Civil War as a kind of a framing device, we can think about the way in which national status is contingent. That it's not something, again, I'm going to build on something you asked earlier, that we strip away the inevitability of the nation. I don't know, it's not a great answer, but it...
Please help me thank again our speakers.